In this demo, I'll be introducing you to the basics of the Godot software used for creating games. I have a finished exercise here that I'll run through, and I'll give you a brief demonstration before we build a new one from scratch, and it'll give me the chance to kind of explain some of the interface here as well. Maybe I'll just start with the interface here. You can see obviously in the middle we do have a screen displaying our work, and if I hit the play button up here, it will show you what we have created. And what you see here are basically two bouncing balls. However, one has a different level of gravity than the other. Down below here I have sort of a floor made up of a series of the built-in icons. So they're kind of like little bricks. I use them like little bricks, if you will. And they prevent the ball from sort of falling through the scene, if you will. Up here I've got just a basic label, and I'll have you create one with your first and last name. Over here we have a button, and if I click it, I've attached a beep sound to it, as you can see here. Now in the background we have a graphic as well, acting just as a static background. No real interactivity, it's just there to decorate the scene, if you will. So I've got a number of elements. I've got a background static element, I've got a couple of these 2D elements acting as balls, and one is just an instance of another. And an instance is basically an iteration of an already created element. And the same deal here with the little bricks at the bottom, that I'm actually using the built-in Godot icon, which is available as a graphic, especially for just testing and trying things out. Okay, so it pops up a little window here that shows you exactly what the result is of what you have so far. So if I can, I'll just play that once more from the beginning here. I'll do rewind and refresh. And you see the two balls starting at the top. They do have gravity applied to them, but different levels of gravity, and that's why they fall at a different rate. Okay, and here's our little button again. Static label, static background, and a static element at the bottom, or a series of static elements at the bottom to create a floor. Okay, so I'm just going to close that now, and maybe we'll do a little roundhouse generally of the areas here. So as I was saying, this is the main scene, and it has all of our elements in it. You can see here I have a number of tabs open. So why don't I take a half step back here and explain the concepts of Godot. It is what is called a node-based software. Nodes are the basic building blocks that we use to create all of our elements. Think of them as like little Lego blocks, but they all have different functions and different properties, if you will, and applications. Some examples would be, if I click on background over here, this is our scene window. So nodes, as I said, are the building blocks, and we use them to create what are called scenes. Scenes are basically collections of nodes, if you will, in a group. And a scene could be a car, could be an element, it could be one of these balls, it could be the background element, and it can have what are known as child nodes. So you can see here with the little indentation here, my background, if I click on background here, we have our inspector over here, and I can see through the inspector that this is what's called a static body 2D element. It's a node called static body 2D. Now that in and of itself isn't going to do a whole lot of good, but it acts as a container and as the parent for anything that comes in it. In this case, I simply added what's known as a sprite 2D. If I click on sprite 2D, the child element here, you can see the particulars of those in the inspector. And in this case, I actually applied a graphic over here in this texture window. And that's what creates the background. Now, because it's static, it's not going to go anywhere. It also doesn't really interact with anything. So there's no real collision or anything like that. Okay. Now, all of these little elements at the bottom here, this is actually my frame size here. So the background image is actually a bit bigger than the frame. But these elements at the bottom are all these, what you see as static body 2D. Now, Godot will rename them when we duplicate them. I could right click here and choose duplicate and create more of them, and then literally click on them on the screen and move them around. Okay, I'm just going to undo that move there. All right, so you can see all of these are basically my bricks at the bottom. Then the two balls, once again, I'll click on rigid body 2D. Rigid body 2D, as opposed to static body, actually allows for gravity, among other things. So there are some distinguishable differences between the different 2D types. We will get much deeper into that as we move along, but for now, rigid body, just so you know, in its inspector, I do have the option of gravity, as you see over here. Okay. Rigid body 2D ball 2 is the exact same thing, except it's the second iteration over here. Also, when I click them, you will see that they highlight on the stage. And if I was to highlight an element on the stage, it also highlights over in the scene window. Okay. Now, if I scroll down here a bit more, we have other unique elements. And these are the label. And that's where you're going to put your first and last name. And again, you can see the inspector has appropriate properties for such an item. Okay. I have a button here. So there are built-in buttons, and they can be triggered, and we can have things happen based on various events. In this case, on pressing the button. Okay. That is done through a feature called signals. Signals basically is a way to make connections for an element to communicate with another element. And it's typically done with code, and the signal is kind of like the wire that connects them, if you will. This icon down here tells me that there is a signal attached to the button. And then finally, if I click on this thing called beep, which is a custom name, by the way, you can custom name all of your nodes. It is actually what's called an audio stream player 2D. So I've just imported a little beep sound, a little MP3, and attached it to the audio stream. Okay, and what I'm doing here is I'm saying when the button is clicked, it will play this node. Okay, and that required the thing called the signal. Okay, now down here in the folder called File System, that is a reflection of your directory that has all the elements for this particular project. Each project needs to be contained in a root directory on your hard drive. So if I can just toggle over to my hard drive for a second here. I am on a Mac, as you can see. I have a folder here that I've already created. And I have one folder for my art. And I had created a test earlier and created a folder for that. Now this actually project is in a whole other folder. But we will create a new folder in here. And that's where we'll start our new project. So maybe while I'm here, let's create a new folder. Okay, so I'm going to right click here. New folder. And the naming convention I'm going to ask you to use is to use your last name underscore lesson number. So my last name is Ouellette. And then underscore, and this is lesson 01. So you can simply put underscore 01. And that's the naming convention. That will be the folder name that actually hosts the new project when I start a new project. Okay, so I'm just going to move that over here a bit and return to Godot and continue with explaining the various panels here. The very top, this is kind of like the top level. Godot can do 2D, 3D, as you can see a 3D plane here. There's a window for the script, which is the code. And I'm giving you a little peek at the code for this file. And I'll explain these elements when we start to build. But these F, U, and C, they're known as functions. And they're basically groups of instructions, if you will, applied as directed by the syntax here. Here is the one for the sound, for example. And this got generated, by the way, by initiating a signal. Okay, so we're saying on button pressed, the element called beep will play. And the syntax in this case is $beep dot play empty brackets. Of course, we will go through the proper syntax as well when we are generating code. But that's in the script window. Okay, I do have a game window here as well, which is not being applied at this point. So for our purposes, we're basically going to use the script window and the 2D window. We will not be working with 3D. There just simply isn't enough time in the one course to work on 3D. But you will get a good idea on how this works, and it systematically works the same whether you're in 2D or 3D. We're going to stick to 2D for the semester, though. So the 2D window displays the artwork and everything you've built within it. And then you can go over here and hit the play button. So we have a run project. You can actually play the separate scenes as well if you hit this one here. But I'm just going to play the whole project. Run project. You can see there it's Command B as well if you're on a Mac. I'm going to assume Control B on a PC. And there is my scene running, as built up until now. Again, the two balls drop. Once they land and bounce out, they're pretty well static, and I don't have a way to interact with them at this point, but obviously in a more sophisticated title, I could create interaction. But they do land on what I'll call the floor, and we have this lovely background scene. We have a nice label up here and a functioning button that beeps when I click it. So we're just going to stick to the basics today just to get familiar with the various panels and the concept of the nodes and what's known as a scene tree. So let me explain again the nodes. The nodes are the building blocks. Even the top level is known as a node, but it's also known as a scene once it has child objects in it. Okay. Now if I collapse this, basically my whole project is in this one, I'll call it the parent node or the main scene. All right. So scenes are collections of nodes. So any elements in your movie is basically going to be a scene. All right, these are all technically are scenes. Now the nice thing too is you see this little icon. It looks like a little clapboard from a movie set. That tells me that I've actually created a unique scene, and that takes me down to the file system folder down here. And you can see here anything that ends in .tscn is a scene, right? So once you save it as a scene, it can be simply dragged out here to create a new instance. I have one already for the ball, for example. So if I was to highlight ball.tscn, I could drag another ball out to the scene. And that is just another instance of these same things. If I was to change the color of the ball or any property, because they are all derived from the same scene, and they are simply instances of that scene, they will take on any property change that I apply in the scene. So you can see up here in my tabs, I actually have it open right now. There's the ball scene. I can zoom up on this with my scroll wheel and then use my spacebar to move this down into view. But I've basically kept the ball at the 0, 0 coordinate, and you can see here it is made up with a rigid body 2D element, and then one of the a child of that is a sprite 2D, and I renamed that sprite 2D element ball. And of course, for it to land or collide, we have a thing called a collision shape, which we can generate here as well. Okay, so the sprite and the collision shape are the child nodes of the main node part of the scene called rigid body 2D underscore ball. And that is an element inside of our file system. The main scene is called, let me just come back down here, home. And you can see it highlighted right here, home.tscn. Okay. When you create your first scene, it automatically considers it the main scene, but that can be changed in our project settings. If I was to go to project settings, under run, I can assign a new scene as the main scene potentially. Okay. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to close this, but that's how you can establish a different scene as your main scene, for example. Okay, we will be returning to this as we work with the software. Okay, and I'll just close that and close that. Now, how do you generate a node to begin with? It's this little plus sign here, and typically it's the add child node. And in here, I would say for now we're going to use the search window because there are a lot of different things. Now I could open the node 2D and come down and find what I need in here. But the search window is really nice because if I want a rigid body, I could just start RIG, for example, and it finds it for me, right? If I highlight that and click create, it would create it over here in my node tree. Again, I'm not going to add this, but I'm just showing you how you can generate these nodes. And then once you have a node generated, you can highlight that node and add a child to that particular node. Okay. So again, the main elements are the nodes and the scenes, which is a collection of nodes. And then the scene tree, this is what you're looking at here, is the scene tree. And it's basically the hierarchy, right? What are the child elements and what are the collections of the various nodes? And then finally, the fourth main element are called signals. And I haven't touched on that yet physically. So the signals are derived in the node panel here. They are in order of the most direct element. So rigid body 2D built-in signals are indicated here. But a rigid body is actually part of a canvas element, part of the node, and you can get very, very complex with these. These are node elements, which will be common to any node, but these up here are signals that are only applicable to the rigid body 2D. So to make that a little more clear, why don't I come over here and click on my button. And I have applied a signal in here, as you kind of saw in the code, and it's unpressed. All right, we're going to learn how to apply this when we create the lesson. But I'm saying when this thing is pressed, it creates this function. And then under here, we actually apply what happens when it gets pressed. Now I can show you this quickly, but I will delete it. It's quite nice actually. If I take this beep, which was already created, I can actually drag that over into the code, and you see what it does? It initiates that with the proper syntax, which is the $sign, and then I could type in press play. And then it's a case of knowing the syntax. Now you see that it's red, that's telling me that there's a problem. As I said, we will get into this code much more in depth later, but the issue here is that anytime you have a function, any element that's nested needs to have an indentation, needs to be tabbed over. So if I tab that over, suddenly it's not, excuse me, it's not red, and it will apply. I will delete that one line though. Okay, so in a nutshell, this was generated by creating a signal, and you can see that a signal is coming from the button, and it's calling out this audio element, which has an MP3 embedded in it, in its properties, in its inspector. Okay, right there, and you can see that there. And that's pretty well how you connect using signals in its simplest form. So let me go back to 2D here and look at the screen, and maybe run that one more time. I can actually hit stop here and play. And now I had the third ball, you remember, that I dragged in, right? This second ball, you can go in and change some elements on the unique scene, but a lot of the elements, such as the graphics, are derived from the source scene down here. Okay. So having said that, maybe it's time to start a brand new file, and we will create what we see here from scratch.